Imagine standing on the walls of a besieged Central Asian city in the 13th century. The horizon is black with horsemen, their banners snapping in the wind. You know the Mongols are coming. Your husband clutches his sword. He's brave, but deep down you both know the truth. Resistance doesn't end in glory, it ends in annihilation. And for women, death might actually be the merciful option. Because what the Mongols did to the wives of defeated warriors was not just brutal. It was policy, it was strategy, and it was systematic. You're standing in the marketplace of a prosperous Central Asian city in the early 13th century. Merchants haggle over silk, spices, and jade. Children chase each other between stalls. But all conversation stops when a scout rides in dust covering his cloak. Panic in his eyes, his words spread faster than fire. The Mongols are coming. For most empires, rumors of invasion meant preparing walls, sharpening swords, or rallying men. But when people heard the Mongols were near, they didn't think about fighting. They thought about running. They thought about hiding their daughters. They thought about digging their own graves in advance. Because the Mongols didn't just conquer with arrows and cavalry charges. They conquered with terror, a weapon as sharp as any blade, and far more efficient. The genius of Genghis Khan wasn't just military tactics, it was psychological warfare. He understood that fear travels faster than any horse. If one city resisted and was annihilated, word would carry to the next 10 cities. Those cities would surrender before a single arrow flew. The Mongols cultivated this fear carefully, deliberately, like farmers tending a crop. And women, tragically, were placed at the center of this grim strategy. But let's not mistake terror for chaos. It wasn't mindless brutality. It was a system. Chronicles from Persia, China, and the Islamic world all record the same pattern. When the Mongols approached, they offered a choice: surrender and pay tribute, or resist and face extermination. Those who surrendered were often spared, at least for the moment, though their women were still subject to seizure. Those who resisted, entire populations were wiped out, their corpses piled into pyramids as warnings. And in the midst of this, the fate of the wives of fallen warriors became a calculated part of Mongol policy. Consider Nishapur in 1221. After the Mongols captured the city, the male population was executed by some estimates, more than 100,000 people. Women were not killed immediately. They were dragged into captivity, parceled out to soldiers, or sent back to camps as slaves. The act wasn't just about satisfying soldiers' desires, it was about obliterating the conquered people's will to resist. What man would dare defy the Mongols, knowing that defeat meant not only his death, but his wife's humiliation and enslavement? The terror wasn't hidden, it was publicized. Survivors were allowed to flee deliberately, carrying stories of horror to the next city down the road. Mongol commanders wanted you to know what had happened to the last town. They wanted the mental images in your head before they even arrived at your gates. It was war by rumor, fear weaponized into surrender. The wives of defeated warriors, in particular, symbolized everything the Mongols wanted to destroy. They represented lineage, continuity, the possibility of rebellion rising again in another generation. By taking these women, violating them, redistributing them, or forcing them into concubinage, the Mongols weren't simply indulging in brutality. They were dismantling the very foundations of enemy society. A widow's grief became a Mongol soldier's trophy. A captured bride became a tool of assimilation. And the stories of these fates, whispered from camp to camp, amplified the terror tenfold. Here's the chilling brilliance. The Mongols didn't need to fight every city. They just needed enough stories of total destruction to ripple across the land. And nothing spread faster than tales of what they did to women. Soldiers might face death bravely, but what husband, what father could face the thought of his wife or daughter subjected to worse than death? That was the psychological trap. The Mongols turned wives into warnings. Their fate was not an accident of war, but a deliberate component of strategy. Fear of what awaited women made entire populations surrender without raising a weapon. And this wasn't unique to one campaign or one Khan, it was replicated across Asia, from the cities of the Khwarezmian Empire to the plains of Eastern Europe. So when we talk about the calculated terror of the Mongol Empire, we're not talking about random atrocities. We're talking about a weaponized system of fear, with women at its center, Every execution, every abduction, every forced remarriage was part of a grand psychological campaign. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory, he conquered minds. And for the wives of defeated warriors, that conquest was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Imagine the city under siege by the Mongols. The walls have held for weeks, maybe even months. The defenders are exhausted, their weapons dulled, their families huddled in fear. And then it happens. The gates fall. But what follows is not the chaos of ordinary battle. What happens next is systematic, deliberate, and chillingly efficient. For men, the Mongols offered a simple fate: death. Adult males of fighting age were rounded up in groups and executed, sometimes outside the city walls, sometimes in the town squares, sometimes in pits already dug in advance. Persian historian Juvayni describes scenes where Mongol soldiers stood men in neat rows, beheading them one by one as if working through an inventory list. This wasn't the rage of warriors, it was procedure. Why kill the men? The Mongols weren't reckless. They understood that leaving even a handful of men alive meant leaving seeds of rebellion. So adult males, whether soldiers, craftsmen, or merchants, were eliminated en masse. Some accounts even describe boys as young as 12 being executed, their lives cut short simply because they were considered future fighters. Resistance wasn't a battle to win, it was a bloodline to erase. But for women, the fate was more complex and in many ways far worse. They were not simply executed and given the finality of death. They were processed. They were transformed into symbols of defeat, into tools of assimilation, and into living reminders of Mongol domination. In conquered cities, women were herded into public spaces, marketplaces, courtyards, the remains of burned temples. The Mongols carried out their own sorting rituals, separating women into categories. Young, attractive women of childbearing age were immediately claimed for the Mongol elite. They became concubines in the camps of generals, commanders, or even the Khan himself. These women weren't chosen randomly, they were trophies, living proof of victory. Others, often those considered less valuable by Mongol standards, were distributed among the common soldiers as spoils of war. Still others were forced into slavery, serving as laborers in camps, hauling supplies, tending horses, or being traded like livestock across the empire's vast trade networks. Women too old or sick to be considered useful were sometimes killed outright, their deaths recorded alongside the slaughter of the men. The cruelty lay not only in the physical violence, but in the psychological warfare. Families were deliberately separated. Mothers were torn from daughters, wives from husbands. Sometimes Mongol soldiers would make women watch the execution of their men before dragging them away, ensuring that the trauma etched itself deep into memory. Other times, husbands were forced to watch their wives claimed by Mongol warriors before being executed themselves. The message was unmistakable. Your bloodline ends here. Your family belongs to us now. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. By killing the men and enslaving the women, the Mongols destroyed the fabric of conquered societies. The men who might fight back were eliminated. The women, who carried culture and continuity, were absorbed into Mongol society or turned into commodities for trade. In both cases, the conquered people's future was erased. Consider the example of Samarkand in 1220. After its fall, Mongol forces carried out mass executions of the male population. Chroniclers describe the streets lined with corpses, rivers running red with blood. But the women weren't simply left to mourn. They were seized, sorted, and dispersed. Some entered the harems of Mongol commanders. Others were sent eastward as slaves, their names and identities erased in transit. Their husbands' deaths weren't the end of the story, they were the beginning of a new, unthinkable ordeal. And this pattern repeated across city after city. Nishapur, Merv, Baghdad, Kiev. Everywhere the Mongols went, the cycle played out with bureaucratic precision. Men faced annihilation. Women faced transformation into property. Death was final, but for women, life became a prison without walls. Here lies the cruel paradox. For the men, death was swift and certain. For the women, survival often meant living with a fate that many contemporary chroniclers described as worse than death. Stripped of kin, of culture, of dignity, They were forced to carry the conqueror's legacy in their very bodies. Their children, born from forced unions, would be raised not as Persians or Khwarezmians or Russians, but as Mongols. Their wombs became tools of assimilation, their lives testimonies of the empire's reach. The Mongols knew this. They understood the psychological devastation the system inflicted. Every man who faced them in battle knew what would happen to his wife and daughters if he lost. The certainty of his own death was bearable. The certainty of their survival under Mongol hands, that was the true horror. It broke resistance before it began. So when we speak of Mongol terror, we must remember, it wasn't just the piles of skulls or the burned cities. It was the deliberate destruction of families, the calculated erasure of societies, and the twisted logic that turned survival into punishment. For men, the sword brought finality. For women, the Mongols had something far worse in store, a future designed to break not just individuals, but entire civilizations. To the Mongols, women of conquered cities were never simply survivors. They were assets. And the way the empire classified and managed them reveals just how systematic Mongol conquest really was. What looked like chaos to outsiders, the screaming, the burning, the tearing apart of families, was in fact carefully organized exploitation. We tend to imagine Mongol raids as mindless destruction, a horde sweeping across the land with no order but slaughter. But the reality, preserved in both Persian chronicles and Mongol administrative practices, was disturbingly different. Women were not only taken as spoils of war for immediate gratification, they were also integrated into the empire's political economy, treated as property, currency, and living instruments of imperial strategy. Let's start with the battlefield. When a city fell, the first women to be seized were those of high-rank wives and daughters of nobles, governors, military leaders. These women were not given to the common soldier. They were claimed directly by Mongol generals or by the Khan himself. Why? Because marrying or keeping them as concubines wasn't simply personal indulgence, it was a political act. Through forced unions, the Mongols absorbed the prestige and legitimacy of defeated dynasties. A conquered princess could become the mother of a Mongol prince, her bloodline erased into the empire's genealogy. But the practice didn't stop at noble blood. Across the empire, women of all backgrounds were distributed according to rank. High-value captives became wives or concubines for the elite. Others were handed to soldiers as rewards for service. Still others were turned into household slaves or traded across the empire's growing networks. The spoils were not random, they were tallied, sorted, and often transported thousands of miles away from their homelands to ensure assimilation and prevent rebellion. And here's where the Mongols differed from many earlier conquerors. They didn't just treat women as prizes to be enjoyed and forgotten, they turned them into part of a larger imperial system. Captured women were sometimes used as bargaining chips in diplomacy, gifted to allied tribes or rival rulers to secure loyalty. A woman taken in Khwarezm might end up in the camp of a Mongol ally in the Caucasus. Her fate wasn't decided by her own choices, but by the needs of empire. Slave markets also became vital arteries of this system. In places like Karakorum and later Kambalik, women from as far apart as Persia, Russia, and China were bought and sold. To the Mongols, human beings could be exchanged alongside horses, textiles, or metalwork. And women, particularly young ones, often carried the highest price. They were valued not just for labor or beauty, but for their ability to bear children who, once raised in Mongol households, would strengthen the empire's population and weaken the identity of the conquered. The Mongols even developed a kind of informal hierarchy of value. Chroniclers note that Turkic and Persian women were often especially prized for their beauty, while Chinese women were valued for their refinement and skills. Steppe women, accustomed to harsh nomadic life, were considered resilient and excellent workers. This wasn't romance, it was commerce, it was empire building, and here lies the most disturbing truth. Women weren't just passive victims of Mongol conquest. They were actively repurposed as tools of empire. Their marriages tied together new political networks. Their children replenished Mongol ranks. Their labor sustained the war machine. They weren't discarded after conquest, they were absorbed, repackaged, and used to strengthen the very system that had destroyed their families. For the common soldier, receiving a woman as booty was framed as a reward, a symbol of loyalty to the Khan. For the elite, claiming the wives of defeated rulers was framed as destiny, proof that the Mongols had been chosen by heaven to dominate the world. And for the empire itself, all of it served a larger purpose, dismantling the conquered, piece by piece, until their blood, their homes, and their very descendants belonged to the Mongol horde. In this system, a wife was not just a wife. She was a weapon. She was a ledger entry. She was a bargaining chip. Her body was battlefield territory, claimed and divided with the same ruthless efficiency as the cities around her. So when we ask, were the wives of defeated warriors spoils of war or imperial assets? The chilling answer is both. To the Mongols, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that every woman taken weakened the enemy and strengthened the empire. Her fate was never her own. It was written in the logic of conquest, in the calculations of generals, in the ink of Mongol scribes who recorded human lives as if they were cargo. For the men who faced the Mongols, death was certain. For the women, the question was not whether they would be taken, but how the empire would choose to use them. And in that grim reality, survival itself became another form of captivity. When a city fell to the Mongols, the slaughter of men was swift, brutal, and predictable. But what came next was not random chaos. It was procedure. It was ritual. It was the systematic dismantling of everything the defeated society had been. And for women, that procedure began with the sorting. Persian chroniclers like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din describe scenes that read less like the aftermath of battle and more like an auction. In the city square, where merchants once sold silks and spices, Mongol soldiers gathered women by the hundred. The surviving population was forced to watch as wives, daughters, and sisters were divided, ranked, and assigned like livestock. The process was both simple and devastatingly effective. The first category consisted of women considered the most valuable, young, physically attractive, and capable of bearing children. These were taken first, often reserved for the elite commanders, generals, or the Khan's household. The fate of these women was sealed immediately. They would never return to their families, never see their homes again. Their identities were erased as they were renamed, reclosed, and absorbed into Mongol harems. The second category included women of middle age, often married widows of fallen warriors. These women were not considered prestigious enough for the Khan or his generals, but they were still useful. Many were distributed among the rank-and-file soldiers as rewards for loyalty and service. To the Mongol army, receiving a woman was not only pleasure, it was compensation. Proof that fighting for the Khan meant material reward. The third category consisted of women considered less desirable, the elderly, the infirm, the sick. These women faced two grim possibilities. Some were executed outright, considered too costly to feed and transport. Others were forced into grueling labor, carrying supplies, tending to livestock, or acting as slaves in Mongol encampments. For these women, survival often meant years of endless servitude under brutal conditions. But the cruelty didn't stop at simple division. The Mongols weaponized the ritual itself. Families were torn apart deliberately. Mothers were separated from daughters, sisters from sisters. Husbands, if still alive, were sometimes made to watch their wives, claimed before being executed. The sorting was conducted in public, not hidden away, because the humiliation and despair it caused were as valuable to the Mongols as the women themselves. Psychological warfare was baked into every step. Children were not exempt. Girls too young to be considered useful were often set aside for what Mongol sources euphemistically called training. In practice, this meant years of preparation for servitude growing up within the Mongol household system, their identities molded until they no longer remember their original culture. Boys, if not executed, were sometimes enslaved as servants, but more often slaughtered to prevent the risk of rebellion in the next generation. The efficiency of this process shocked contemporary observers. At Nishapur, where tens of thousands were killed in 1221, chronicles describe mountains of corpses alongside the grim spectacle of women and children being sorted in the same public squares where their men had been executed. At Merv, Baghdad, and Kiev, the pattern repeated almost identically. The Mongols didn't invent this method, but they industrialized it, carrying it out with chilling consistency across Asia and into Europe. Even the terminology reflected this bureaucratic mindset. In Mongol military law, captured women were often referred to in terms of shares. Just as plunder was divided according to rank gold, livestock, textiles, so too were women. Each soldier, from the lowliest horseman to the highest general, expected his due portion. This wasn't treated as a crime of war. It was policy. It was entitlement. It was empire. And for the women themselves, the sorting ritual marked the death of everything they had known. Names were changed, identities erased, and futures dictated in a single afternoon of division. A girl might find herself in the Khan's camp one day and sold across the empire the next. A mother might be dragged east into Mongolia while her daughter was sent west into Persia. Families dissolved in moments, scattered across thousands of miles, never to be reunited. But the most insidious part was how deliberate it all was. The Mongols understood that this ritual destroyed not only individuals, but entire communities. By sorting, reassigning, and dispersing women, they ensured that defeated societies could never reform themselves. No families, no continuity, no cultural survival. Resistance didn't just cost lives, it cost the very possibility of a future. So when the city saw the Mongol banners approaching, its people knew what awaited them. Not just death in battle, not just fire and ruin, but the sorting, the public humiliation, the tearing apart of families, the reduction of wives and daughters into spoils of war. And for many, that knowledge was enough to break their will before the first arrow even flew. The sorting ritual was not a side effect of Mongol conquest. It was the conquest. It was how the empire dismantled societies and rebuilt them in its own image. And for the wives of defeated warriors, it was the moment their lives ended, even if their bodies continued to breathe. When we think of Mongol harems, the image that often comes to mind is one of decadence. Silk-draped chambers, veiled women, exotic luxury. But this picture is misleading. For the Mongols, concubinage was not only personal indulgence, it was policy. It was an instrument of power, assimilation, and demographic engineering. From Genghis Khan onward, Mongol rulers and generals built massive harems composed largely of women taken from conquered peoples. These harems were not hidden curiosities, they were public symbols of domination. To claim a defeated ruler's wife, or to father children with a captured princess, was to proclaim absolute victory. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about erasing dynasties and absorbing their prestige into the Mongol fold. Take Genghis Khan himself. Chroniclers record that he fathered children with women from nearly every people he conquered. Tangut, Khitan, Persian, Turkic, and more. Each of these unions, however violent or forced, created blood ties that tethered conquered elites to the Mongol imperial family. In steppe culture, kinship meant legitimacy. By fathering children through concubinage, the Khan turned the daughters of defeated rulers into the mothers of Mongol heirs. The conquered bloodlines did not vanish, they were consumed. But concubinage was not limited to the Khan. His generals and princes maintained their own extensive harems, swelling with every new campaign. Women from Central Asia, Persia, and even Eastern Europe filled these camps. Some were kept as concubines, others as slaves, but all served the same imperial purpose: to tie diverse populations into a single Mongol-centered system. Here's where the bureaucracy comes in. These harems weren't chaotic collections of captives. They were organized institutions. Women were categorized by origin, status, and function. Those of noble birth were often elevated, treated as secondary wives with some degree of influence. Others, considered less prestigious, were reduced to servants or sexual property. And the children born from these arrangements were tracked carefully. The empire valued concubinage because it produced heirs who were unmistakably Mongol, yet carried the blood of conquered peoples. This was demographic assimilation at its most intimate level. Every child born blurred the line between conqueror and conquered, binding the empire together through forced kinship. For the Mongols, this was a feature, not a flaw. Consider Ogedei Khan, Genghis' son and successor. His household reportedly contained hundreds of women, many of them captives from conquered territories. Persian sources describe his court as a place where women of every ethnicity, Chinese, Persian, Russian, Khwarezmian, coexisted under the Mongol banner. To outsiders, it looked like diversity. In reality, it was domination. The physical proof that no culture was beyond Mongol reach, but for the women themselves, life in these harems was a prison. They were stripped of names, forced to adopt Mongol or Turkic identities, and often subjected to constant surveillance. Resistance was nearly impossible. Escape meant death, and rebellion meant execution. Chroniclers hint that women who defied their roles were punished brutally, not just to maintain order, but to remind others of the consequences. Yet the harems also served as political instruments. Gifting women to allies or vassals was common. A captured Persian noblewoman might be given to a Mongol general to seal loyalty. A Russian princess could be forced into marriage with a Mongol prince, turning a conquered dynasty into an appendage of the Khan's family. Women became currency in diplomacy, traded not for gold or horses, but for allegiance and obedience. What's most disturbing is the scale. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, and in every corner, concubinage reinforced the same message. No household, no dynasty, no family was beyond Mongol reach. From the Silk Road cities to the plains of Hungary, women were transformed into living symbols of subjugation. The practice also had ripple effects. Entire communities knew what awaited their women if they resisted. Fathers and husbands didn't just fear death, they feared the concubinage system that would claim their wives and daughters. This fear spread faster than cavalry, ensuring that many cities surrendered without a fight. In this sense, concubinage was not only private exploitation, it was public propaganda, and the legacy endures. Genetic studies today show the staggering reach of Genghis Khan's bloodline, with millions of men across Asia believed to descend from him. This isn't a romantic tale of prolific love. It is the scientific proof of concubinage, as state policy of conquest, written into DNA, generation after generation. So when we examine Mongol concubinage, we must strip away the illusions of luxury and romance. It was not a side effect of war. It was war itself, a continuation of conquest through the female body, a calculated strategy to erase old dynasties, cement Mongol supremacy, and reproduce empire in every sense of the word. For the wives of defeated warriors, concubinage wasn't survival. It was captivity without end. A reminder that the empire did not just conquer land. It conquered bloodlines, identities, and futures. In most cultures, marriage is a covenant, a bond of kinship, loyalty, and protection. But under the Mongol war machine, marriage could also be a death sentence. For the men who stood against the empire, defeat meant execution. For their wives, it meant something that, in many ways, was worse, a forced remarriage dictated by the sword. The Mongols had a chilling custom. When a warrior fell in battle, his wife automatically became the property of the man who killed him. This wasn't a matter of passion or impulse. It was policy. A warrior's victory wasn't measured only in loot or prestige. It was measured in flesh, in the women he could now claim as his own. Widowhood became a bureaucratic process, enforced with military discipline. Chroniclers describe how this system played out in conquered cities. After the slaughter of men, women were gathered and divided into categories. Among them, widows of slain warriors held a special place. They weren't executed, not immediately. Instead, they were redistributed as prizes to the very men who had killed their husbands. The Mongols called this justice, a way of rewarding bravery and ensuring loyalty. But for the women themselves, it was a living nightmare. Imagine the cruelty. A woman watches her husband die on the battlefield, or perhaps sees him executed in the public square. Within hours, sometimes even minutes, she is forced into the arms of his killer. The Mongols treated this not as an atrocity, but as an official transfer of property. A wife was as much a part of the spoils as a sword or a horse. The process was disturbingly formal. Some sources suggest that warriors who claimed widows were required to present witnesses, 3 men, in many cases to legitimize their ownership. If a warrior failed to stake his claim quickly, the widow could be reassigned to another. Disputes over widows were recorded like property disputes, resolved in Mongol courts with the same cold detachment given to livestock or land. But the horror didn't end with forced remarriage. The Mongols deliberately stripped these women of their former identities. Names were changed, often replaced with Turkic or Mongol alternatives. Religious conversion was sometimes enforced, tearing them away from the spiritual traditions of their ancestors. And always, the children born of these unions carried Mongol blood, not the lineage of the defeated. In this way, the Mongols erased not just husbands, but entire family lines. This system was more than cruelty, it was strategy. By forcing the wives of slain warriors into new marriages with their conquerors, the Mongols dismantled the very foundations of enemy society. Marriage, once the cornerstone of kinship and continuity, became a weapon. No family could survive intact. No lineage could continue unbroken. The Mongols transformed their enemies' wives into living proof that resistance was futile. The practice also had a psychological dimension. Men who faced the Mongols knew that death was certain, but what truly broke their spirit was the thought of what awaited their wives. To die in battle was one thing. To die knowing your wife will be claimed by your enemy, forced into his bed, made to bear his children, that knowledge spread terror more effectively than any arrow storm. It turned courage into despair, resistance into surrender. We see echoes of this in Persian and Chinese chronicles. At Nishapur, Samarkand, and countless other cities, widows of slain nobles and generals were seized and absorbed into the Mongol elite. Some were forced into the harems of khans and princes, their new status advertised as a political triumph. Others were given to common soldiers as rewards, their value reduced to nothing more than the token of loyalty. In some cases, the Mongols even used these forced marriages to stabilize their rule. By marrying the widows of defeated rulers, they claimed legitimacy over conquered territories. The union was never consensual, but it carried symbolic weight. The message was clear. The old dynasty was gone. Its women now belonged to the conquerors. Its future was absorbed into Mongol bloodlines. And for the women themselves, there was no escape. Refusal wasn't an option. Defiance could mean execution, not only for the woman, but sometimes for her children as well. Submission was the only path to survival, but it was survival at the cost of identity, dignity, and freedom. So when we speak of marriage by death warrant, we are describing one of the most sinister aspects of Mongol conquest, a system that turned widowhood into enslavement, that transformed love and loyalty into instruments of domination. For the wives of defeated warriors, the death of their husbands was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of a life in which their very existence was a trophy for their enemies. The Mongols understood something that makes this all the more chilling. To conquer a man, you must kill him. But to conquer a people, you must claim their women. And by turning marriage into policy, by turning widows into spoils, the Mongols ensured that no victory was temporary, no conquest incomplete. When a city fell to the Mongols, the conquest did not end with the slaughter of men or the redistribution of women. That was only the first stage. The true conquest happened afterward, not on the battlefield, but within the mind. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival meant undergoing a deliberate process of erasure, a dismantling of who they had been until nothing remained but obedience to the Khan. The Mongols understood something profound. It wasn't enough to control land. To truly rule, they had to control people. And to control people, you had to erase their memory of being anything else. Women, taken as concubines, wives, or slaves, became the front line of this psychological campaign. The erasure began with names. In steppe tradition, names carried enormous significance, tying individuals to clans, lineages, and ancestors. Forcibly renaming a woman severed her from that lineage. A Khwarezmian woman might be stripped of her Persian name and given a Mongol or Turkic one. A Russian captive might be called by a new title that reflected servitude rather than heritage. It seemed small a word, a syllable, but it was the symbolic annihilation of her former self. Religion was another target. Many Mongol leaders were pragmatic in their tolerance of faith, but this tolerance rarely extended to the women they claimed. Captives from Muslim or Christian communities were often pressured into adopting Mongol or steppe shamanist practices. Conversion wasn't always forced at sword point. More often, it was woven into daily survival. To eat, to marry, to live in the Khan's household, one had to participate in rituals, recite prayers, and submit to the conqueror's gods. The message was clear: your old gods abandoned you. The Khan's sky deity, eternal blue heaven, now owns you. Clothing, too, became part of the erasure. Chronicles tell us that women taken into Mongol households were dressed in steppe garments, stripped of the silks, veils, or regional dress that once marked their identity. To change clothes was to change allegiance. A Persian noblewoman in embroidered robes could become, in a matter of days, indistinguishable from a Mongol camp wife. The transformation was visual propaganda proof that the Khan could take any woman, any culture, and make it his. But the most devastating part of this process was in the children. Women forced into concubinage bore sons and daughters who were raised not in their mother's culture, but in the Mongol one. Steppe customs, Mongol language, Mongol loyalty, these became the inheritance. A woman who once dreamed of raising her children as Persians, Chinese, or Russians now watched them grow into Mongols, her own bloodline hijacked. And for many, this was the ultimate erasure. To live long enough to see your lineage survive, but not as yours. Even memory was targeted. Women were deliberately scattered far from their homeland. A girl taken from Bukhara might end up in Karakorum, thousands of miles away. A Russian captive might find herself in Central Asia, surrounded by strangers. Isolation was not incidental. It was a strategy to cut them off from familiar languages, customs, and kin. Alone, surrounded by conquerors, their identities dissolved under pressure. The Mongols also practiced a more insidious form of psychological control. Chroniclers describe how captives were told their families were dead, their villages burned, their cultures obliterated. Sometimes this was true, other times it was a calculated lie. Either way, the goal was the same: to sever hope. A woman who believes she has no past will no longer dream of escaping to it. Her only future lies with her captors. What makes this all the more terrifying is the precision of it. This wasn't chaotic brutality, it was policy. Just as lands were surveyed and taxed, so too were women processed and stripped of identity. The Mongols didn't merely want submission, they wanted transformation. Every renamed wife, every baptized child, every foreign noblewoman in the Mongol tent was a living declaration that no culture, no dynasty, no tradition could resist assimilation. And yet, the erasure was not complete. In whispered songs, in fragments of language passed to their children, some women carried pieces of their lost selves. Chronicles hint at moments when captives spoke to each other in their mother tongues or quietly clung to forbidden prayers. But these were acts of resistance in a system designed to smother them. For every voice that remembered, countless others were silenced. So when we speak of the erasure of identity under Mongol conquest, we are not just describing the fate of individuals. We are describing the destruction of continuity itself. Women were not merely taken, they were remade. Their names, their faiths, their clothes, their children, all rewritten to serve the empire. For the wives of defeated warriors, death would have preserved memory, lineage, and dignity. Survival under Mongol rule meant something far more haunting: to live long enough to forget who you were. When we think of Mongol conquests, we picture cavalry charges, flaming arrows, and cities in ruins. But the most powerful weapon in the Mongol arsenal wasn't the composite bow or the horse, it was terror. And one of the most devastating ways they spread that terror was through sexual violence, not as random brutality, but as a calculated strategy of psychological warfare. Chroniclers from Persia to China describe a pattern that repeated itself with disturbing consistency. When the Mongols stormed the city, the fate of the men was simple: execution. But the fate of the women was designed not just to punish them, but to send a message. Public rape, forced concubinage, and the redistribution of women were carried out in the open, in full view of survivors. It wasn't about lust, It was about domination, domination so absolute that it destroyed not only bodies, but spirits. The Mongols understood something that most medieval armies only practiced incidentally. Sexual violence was a language. It spoke to the conquered louder than decrees or treaties ever could. To seize a man's wife or daughter in front of him was to reduce his life, his honor, his lineage to ashes. And when news of that cruelty spread, it did the work of entire armies. Cities surrendered without resistance, not because they couldn't fight, but because they couldn't bear to imagine what would happen to their women if they lost. Let's look at an example. At Nishapur in 1221, after the city rebelled against Mongol control, Genghis Khan's son-in-law led the retribution. The male population was massacred. Women and children were taken en masse. Contemporary accounts describe them being divided, distributed, and in many cases subjected to violence so horrifying that survivors carry the stories for generations. But here's the detail that matters. The Mongols wanted those stories to spread. They allowed survivors to flee, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Every refugee who reached the next city carried with them tales of the unspeakable. Fear galloped ahead of the Mongol horde. Even the staging of violence was deliberate. Families were often forced to watch as daughters were dragged away, or as infants were killed before their mothers' eyes. Husbands were sometimes executed only after witnessing the violation of their wives. These weren't random cruelties, they were scripted performances of terror, psychological theater designed to leave survivors broken before they ever considered resistance again. And it worked. Chroniclers record entire cities opening their gates at the mere rumor of Mongol approach. In places like Bukhara and Samarkand, surrender came not after prolonged sieges, but before them, because people had already heard what had happened to women in the last city that resisted. Sexual violence became propaganda, a weapon sharper than steel. The Mongols also weaponized scale. Unlike raiding bands or undisciplined armies, they didn't leave these acts to chance. They systematized them. When a city fell, women were rounded up in public, sorted, and distributed according to rank. The spectacle itself was part of the conquest. The sight of noble women stripped of status, of daughters screaming for mothers torn from them, this was the real siege weapon. It ensured that anyone watching understood the consequences of defiance. Psychological warfare also extended into assimilation. By forcing women into concubinage, by compelling them to bear Mongol children, the empire didn't just humiliate the present generation, it colonized the future. Every child born of these forced unions was a living reminder that the Mongols had conquered not just the city, but the very bloodline of its people. Fathers were killed, but their wives were forced to carry the children of their killers. It was conquest written into flesh. The cruelty was multi-layered. For men, death was quick. For women, survival meant becoming the tool of their enemy's power. And for the broader population, the knowledge of this reality was paralyzing. To resist the Mongols wasn't just to risk death. It was to condemn one's wife, one's daughter, one's entire community to a fate worse than death. This knowledge spread like wildfire, breaking cities before the Mongols even arrived. And that was the genius and the horror of it. Sexual violence wasn't a side effect of war. It was policy. It was psychological strategy. It was the shadow that rode ahead of the Mongol cavalry, toppling walls before the first arrow was loosed. For the wives of defeated warriors, this meant their suffering wasn't incidental. It was intentional. Their bodies became the battlefield after the battle. Their humiliation became the empire's strongest weapon. And their stories, carried by terrified survivors, became the whispers that make cities collapse without a fight. So when we speak of Mongol terror, we must recognize that their greatest victories weren't won by sword alone. They were won through fear, fear that spread through women's suffering, fear that lived on long after the fires died down. When the city fell to the Mongols, the fate of men was sealed in execution pits, and the fate of women was written in captivity. But what about the children, those who were born after conquest, the offspring of forced unions between Mongol warriors and conquered women? For the empire, these children were not accidents of war. They were strategy. They were the living embodiment of conquest, proof that the Mongols had not only destroyed the present but had colonized the future. From Genghis Khan's generation onward, chronicles record that Mongol rulers and generals fathered children with women from nearly every land they conquered. Persian princesses, Tangut noblewomen, Russian captives, Chinese court ladies all found themselves absorbed into Mongol harems and households. Their children, raised within the Mongol fold, were stripped of any connection to their mother's people. They spoke Mongol, wore steppe clothing, and worshipped the eternal blue sky of Tengri. They were born of conquest, and they were raised to serve it. This process was deliberate. The Mongols understood the symbolic power of lineage. To father children with the wives or daughters of defeated rulers wasn't just a personal victory, it was a political act. The bloodlines of conquered dynasties were folded into the Mongol family tree, erased as independent lines, and repurposed as proof of Mongol legitimacy. A Khwarezmian princess might once have been heir to a proud Islamic dynasty. After conquest, her son became a Mongol prince. The dynasty survived, but only as a tributary branch of the Khan's line, and the scale was staggering. Modern genetic studies suggest that as many as 16 million men alive today may descend from Genghis Khan himself. That number isn't the product of romance. It is the legacy of systemic concubinage and forced reproduction. The empire spread not only through cavalry charges, but through bloodlines deliberately seeded across Asia. Each child born to a captive woman was another thread tying the conquered into the Mongol web. For the women, this was a prison without walls. They carried children who were half their own blood, yet wholly alien to their identity. These children were raised to see themselves not as Persians, Chinese, or Russians, but as Mongols. A mother who whispered her old prayers or songs risked punishment, even death, and yet many did. Chroniclers hint at fragments of resistance, mothers secretly teaching their children words of their native tongue or telling them stories of their lost fathers. But the empire's grip was strong. By the time those children grew, their loyalties belonged to the Khan. The psychological impact was devastating. For conquered men, death was one thing. But to know that their wives would bear the children of their killers, that was humiliation on a generational scale. Resistance became despair. Even in death, they could not prevent their enemy from continuing their line with their own blood. For the Mongols, however, this system solved two problems at once. First, it ensured loyalty. A child born into a Mongol household had no memory of his mother's people, no ties to a father's dynasty. His survival depended on the empire, and so his loyalty was assured. Second, it expanded the Mongol population at unprecedented speed. By absorbing conquered women into their ranks, the Mongols transformed enemies into resources, human capital repurposed for imperial growth. But there was a darker layer still. Not all children were welcome. Sources suggest that infants who resembled their mothers too closely, or who carried features that reminded captors of their enemies, were sometimes killed at birth. Others were taken from their mothers at young ages, raised in separate households, severing maternal bonds to prevent rebellion. For the mothers, this meant that survival did not guarantee love. Even their children could be stolen, reclassified, and used against them. And yet, the empire flaunted these children. Chroniclers note that Mongol leaders paraded their mixed-blood offspring as proof of universal domination. The message was clear. Not only had the Khan conquered nations, but he had planted his seed within them. No people could escape assimilation, because their very descendants carried Mongol blood. The long-term impact of this policy cannot be overstated. Entire dynasties collapsed not only on the battlefield but in the nursery. Women of noble birth, once mothers of kings-to-be, now bore the children of their families' destroyers. Their sons and daughters grew up to serve Mongol rulers, sometimes even sent back to govern their mother's homeland, a cruel inversion in which the conquered were forced to administer their own submission. For the wives of defeated warriors, this was the final cruelty. Their husbands had been executed, their families scattered, their names erased. And now, their children, the one hope of preserving lineage, became the empire's property. To survive was to watch your future carried away in the hands of your captors, to know that even your blood no longer belonged to you. So when we speak of the children of conquest, we are not speaking of accidents of war, but of deliberate strategy. These children were the empire's most enduring weapon proof that Mongol victory was not temporary, but eternal. Long after cities were rebuilt and battlefields forgotten, the bloodlines remained, silent reminders that the Mongols had not just conquered land, but had rewritten humanity itself. When the Mongols conquered a city, they did not simply destroy, they calculated. To them, everything livestock, grain, weapons, artisans, and yes, women had an economic value. And like horses or silks, women were entered into the empire's vast system of plunder, tribute, and redistribution. Their humanity was stripped away, replaced by numbers, categories, and worth measured in exchange. Chroniclers from Persia and China note how, after the slaughter of men, women were rounded up, not just for sexual violence, but for inventory. In the same way Mongol scribes tallied horses and camels, they counted women. They were sorted into groups, those suitable for concubinage, those for domestic service, those for agricultural or camp labor, and those considered too old or weak, often executed rather than maintained as unprofitable. This was not random cruelty, it was accounting. In many cases, women became part of the Mongol economy in the most literal sense. They were traded along caravan routes, sold in markets from Samarkand to Karakorum. A young Persian girl could fetch a high price among Mongol nobles. A Russian captive might be exchanged for horses, falcons, or weapons. Slave markets flourished under Mongol control, with women treated as commodities whose value fluctuated with supply, demand, and even beauty standards of the steppe. But the most chilling element was how bureaucratically this was managed. Surviving records, especially from later Mongol-ruled territories like Yuan China, show women listed alongside livestock, grain, and textiles in requisition lists. A consignment might include 50 bolts of silk, 100 sheep, and 20 maidens of fine age. There was no distinction in tone. Women were assets, nothing more, nothing less. The economic value of women extended beyond markets. Within the Mongol army itself, the redistribution of women was framed as payment. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle could expect rewards not only of gold and livestock, but of human captives. A wife or daughter of a defeated warrior became the coin of loyalty, ensuring that Mongol warriors fought with ferocity. To serve the Khan faithfully was to be compensated in flesh. Women also became diplomatic currency. Marriages were engineered not from love, but from conquest. A noble woman taken in war might be gifted to a Mongol general, binding him closer to the Khan. Another might be presented to a vassal chief as proof of the Khan's generosity. In this way, the Mongols turned captured women into living treaties, their bodies the ink with which politics was written. The economic calculus went further. Women's reproductive potential was itself a kind of investment. A young captive, capable of bearing multiple children, was valued far higher than an older woman. To the Mongols, children were not only heirs, they were population growth, soldiers for the future, workers for the empire. By impregnating conquered women, the Mongols converted them into factories of empire, producing new generations whose loyalties would lie with their father's people. Slave caravans illustrate this grim arithmetic. Women and girls were transported in chains, herded alongside livestock, often forced to march for weeks or months. Mortality rates were high, but to the Mongols, this was factored into the cost. If enough survived to be sold at market or absorbed into households, the losses were acceptable. To them, human suffering was no different than spoilage in a shipment of grain. The public dimension of this commodification amplified its psychological effect. Survivors of conquest watched as their wives and daughters were appraised, bargained over, and handed off like trade goods. The humiliation was deliberate. The Mongols understood that to see one's family reduced to property was to crush not only the body but the soul. It ensured that rebellion would wither, that submission would root itself deep. What makes this more haunting is how normalized it became. In the Mongol worldview, there was no contradiction in treating women as both concubines and commodities. They were assets whose value could be sexual, political, or economic, depending on what the empire required. A single woman might pass through multiple roles in her lifetime: war spoil, soldier's concubine, traded slave, diplomatic gift. Her identity was irrelevant. Only her utility mattered. And the ripple effects lasted for generations. In conquered regions, families lived with the knowledge that their daughters could be taken at any moment, not just in war, but through tribute levies and raids. The fear was economic as much as physical. A daughter was not only a beloved child, she was potential currency for the empire, a resource to be seized and redistributed. So when we ask what value the Mongols place on women, the answer is chillingly simple: the value of property, the value of livestock, the value of trade. Women were not individuals, but assets measured in the calculus of empire. Their worth was not in who they were, but in what they could yield as concubines, as workers, as mothers, or as bargaining chips. For the wives of defeated warriors, this meant their fate was never theirs to choose. They were entered into ledgers, assigned worth, and treated as coin in the empire's relentless expansion. Death would have ended their suffering. Survival meant living as a line item in someone else's inventory. For most societies, marriage was a sacred institution, a way to unite families, pass on heritage, and preserve culture. But for the Mongols, marriage in the context of conquest was something very different. It was a weapon. It was assimilation by force, a way to turn enemies into subjects, and to bind conquered people so tightly to the empire that they could never break free again. The logic was brutally simple. If the men of a society were executed, and its women were forced into unions with Mongol warriors, then within a single generation the culture of the conquered would disappear. What had been Persian, Russian, Khwarezmian, or Chinese would, through marriage and childbearing, become Mongol. This was not an accident of war, it was policy. The Mongols did not treat the wives of defeated warriors as widows to be pitied. They treated them as resources to be reassigned. A widow might be claimed by the very soldier who killed her husband, or she might be presented to a Mongol officer as a reward for service. In either case, her marriage was no longer a covenant of love. It was a transfer of ownership, enforced by the sword. For noble women, the process was even more political. A princess or highborn lady was a prize, not only for her beauty or status, but for what she represented. By forcing her into marriage with a Mongol prince or general, the Khan didn't just seize a woman, he seized legitimacy. Her children would carry the blood of her dynasty, but they would be Mongol heirs. Her lineage, once proud and independent, was rewritten into the Khan's family tree. This was especially important in Central Asia and the Islamic world, where dynastic legitimacy was tied to bloodlines. By marrying into conquered families, even if by coercion the Mongols claimed continuity, it was a way of saying, your dynasty is not dead. It lives on in us. But of course, it lived on only as a conquered fragment, absorbed into the empire. For ordinary women, assimilation through marriage was less about politics and more about survival. Once taken into a Mongol household, they were forced to adopt the language, clothing, and customs of their captors. Children born of these unions were raised as Mongols. Over time, even memory of the woman's original culture faded, replaced by the rhythms of steppe life. Entire bloodlines vanished this way, not because the women died, but because their children no longer carry their culture. The Mongols even used this system as a form of social control. Soldiers were rewarded with wives taken from conquered peoples, but these unions also tied the soldiers themselves more tightly to the empire. A warrior with a foreign wife and children was less likely to abandon the army or rebel because his household was now invested in Mongol power. The system reinforced itself. Conquest produced marriages, marriages produced children, and children produced loyalty. This assimilation wasn't limited to the battlefield. Tribute systems sometimes required conquered peoples to provide women as part of their obligations to the empire. These women were then distributed as concubines or wives among Mongol elites. In effect, they became living tax payments, symbols of submission, and guarantors of peace. Every such marriage was a reminder that resistance had been crushed, and that even the most intimate bonds of society now belonged to the Khan. But the system was also psychological warfare. Husbands knew that if they fell in battle, their wives would not simply be widowed. They would be absorbed into the enemy camp, forced into new unions, and compelled to bear children for the very men who had killed their husbands. This knowledge broke morale as effectively as any siege engine. To resist was to condemn one's family to assimilation. To surrender was to hope, however faintly, that they might be spared the worst. The Mongols understood the symbolism. Chroniclers describe them parading captured noble women in public, forcing them into marriages with Mongol commanders before the eyes of their defeated subjects. The message was clear. Your rulers are gone, their wives are ours, their children will be ours. Your dynasty is finished. Even after conquest, the system reinforced imperial control. A woman who bore Mongol children was tied irrevocably to the empire. She could no longer claim loyalty to her old people without betraying her own offspring. The conquerors had discovered a cruel paradox. By making women mothers, they made them complicit in their own assimilation. Survival meant raising children who erased their past. This was the essence of forced assimilation through marriage. It was not about love, nor even about lust. It was about control. Control of families, control of bloodlines, control of the future. For the wives of defeated warriors, it meant that even after death had claimed their husbands, their lives were still claimed by the Khan. Their wombs became the empire's weapon, their children the empire's trophies. And for the Mongols, this was victory. Not just in the moment, but forever. A city could be rebuilt, a wall could be repaired, but a bloodline absorbed was lost for good. The empire expanded not only through battles, but through marriages written in blood and sealed with the erasure of entire peoples. For most empires, resistance was a risk. A city might be besieged, punished, and plundered, but eventually rebuilt. Under the Mongols, resistance was something else entirely. It was suicide. To defy the Khan was to invite not only death, but extinction, the deliberate annihilation of your people, your culture, and your very memory. The Mongols perfected what we might call exemplary destruction. Their strategy was simple: make examples so terrifying that the next city would never dare resist. And the cost of resistance fell not only on soldiers, but on civilians, especially the women who survived their husband's execution, only to face a fate more horrifying than death. Consider the city of Nishapur in 1221. After its citizens rebelled against Mongol rule, the response was absolute. Genghis Khan's son-in-law, enraged by the death of a Mongol prince, ordered a massacre so complete that chroniclers struggle to find words. Men, women, children, as many as 100,000 by some estimates, were slaughtered. The corpses were piled into pyramids, grim monuments to Mongol vengeance. But for the women who were spared immediate execution, survival was no mercy. They were dragged into captivity, parceled out as slaves and concubines, their lives reduced to reminders of their city's obliteration. The same pattern repeated across Central Asia. At Merv, resistance led to the death of nearly an entire population, with women once again divided into spoils. At Urgench, after weeks of bloody fighting, so many captives were taken that even the Mongols struggled to process them. In Baghdad in 1258, after the city resisted, the Mongols unleashed such devastation that the Tigris reportedly ran black with ink from looted libraries and red with blood from slaughtered inhabitants. The men were executed, the women and children were taken. Resistance had turned one of the world's greatest cities into a graveyard. This was the Mongol bargain: surrender and you might live, even if that life meant servitude and humiliation. Resist and you would be erased. It was a logic designed to break the will of entire civilizations. Husbands who might otherwise have chosen to fight knew that defiance meant not only their own deaths, but the violation and enslavement of their wives, the scattering of their children, and the obliteration of their lineage. The Mongols publicized these massacres deliberately. Survivors were allowed to escape, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. They became walking messengers of horror, carrying tales of rape, slavery, and extinction to the next city down the road. The stories were consistent: men executed in mass graves, women sorted and claimed, children enslaved or killed. Resistance didn't mean defeat, it meant obliteration. The fate of women in these scenarios was particularly cruel. In cities that resisted, they were treated with even less restraint than usual. Soldiers who had endured long sieges considered them spoils of hard-won victory, and their suffering became part of the punishment inflicted on the population. Noble women, once symbols of dynastic pride, were paraded as trophies, their forced marriages used to demonstrate the Khan's supremacy. Ordinary women were herded like livestock, their identities stripped as they were absorbed into Mongol households or sold in slave markets thousands of miles away. Even children were not spared. Boys who might grow up to resist were often slaughtered. Girls too young for concubinage were forced into servitude, raised in Mongol households until they could be used. The future itself was erased, ensuring that resistance was not only punished in the present, but prevented from arising again in the next generation. And yet, the Mongols' use of extinction was not mindless. It was methodical. They did not exterminate every city they conquered, only those that resisted. The contrast was intentional. Cities that surrendered might still lose their men and see their women enslaved, but they were spared total destruction. Cities that resisted became smoldering warnings to all others. It was empire building through selective annihilation. For the wives of defeated warriors, this meant their fate was tied not only to their husband's courage, but to the decisions of their city as a whole. If the rulers resisted, the women bore the consequences. They became living remnants of societies that no longer existed, reminders that resistance had been punished with extinction. To survive in such circumstances was to carry the memory of one's people alone, often in silence, surrounded by enemies who had killed everyone else. The psychological power of this system cannot be overstated. When word spread that Nishapur, Merv, and Baghdad had been annihilated, entire regions capitulated without a fight. Fathers chose submission over the knowledge that their daughters would suffer the fate of conquered women in cities that resisted. Husbands laid down their arms rather than see their wives enslaved as punishment for defiance. The Mongols had made resistance not simply dangerous, but unthinkable. This was the cruel genius of their empire. They didn't need to annihilate everyone only enough to ensure the rest surrendered. But for those who did resist, extinction was complete. Their men were slaughtered. Their women were transformed into spoils. Their children were scattered or killed. Their cities became ash and bone. For the Mongols, resistance meant extinction. For the wives of defeated warriors, it meant the destruction of everything they had, been family, lineage, identity, leaving them alive only as vessels of conquest. And for those who watched from afar, it was a warning written in blood: surrender or cease to exist. When whispers of Mongol banners on the horizon reached the city, panic followed close behind. Men sharpened their swords, yes, but in homes and markets, behind the high walls, a more desperate question loomed. What will happen to our wives and daughters? Everyone knew the stories. Everyone had heard what became of women in Nishapur, Merv, and Samarkand. And so, before the first arrow was loosed, families scrambled to devise survival strategies, some desperate, some clever, most tragically futile. One of the most common strategies was concealment. Families dug cellars beneath their homes or walled off secret chambers, hiding wives and daughters in the hope that the Mongols would not search too closely. Some women were smuggled into monasteries or mosques, disguised as servants or novices. Others were dressed as boys, their hair cut short, their faces dirtied, in a desperate attempt to make them invisible among captives. Chronicles from Persia and Rus lands tell of families who hid women in wells, barns, even burial vaults, hoping the conquerors would pass them by. But the Mongols were thorough. They were masters of siege and plunder, and they knew captives were as valuable as gold. Soldiers scoured homes, temples, and hiding places. Even when women were disguised, sharp-eyed warriors often recognized them. Discovered concealments were punished brutally, not just with the capture of women, but with executions of entire families. To resist the redistribution of women was to defy the Khan's spoils, and that was an unforgivable crime. Another strategy was deliberate disfigurement. In some communities, mothers scarred their daughters' faces with burns or cuts, hoping to make them less appealing to their conquerors. Others smeared their daughters in dirt, ash, or animal dung to mask their beauty. In rare cases, women even knocked out their own teeth or shaved their heads, desperate to appear undesirable. These acts were heartbreaking families, choosing to wound their own children rather than see them claimed as trophies. Yet even this often failed. Mongol soldiers were not easily dissuaded. A scarred or disguised woman was still a spoil, still a laborer, still a womb that could bear children. Flight was another strategy. Entire caravans of refugees fled ahead of the Mongol advance, abandoning cities to seek safety in mountains, deserts, or forests. Mothers carried infants on their backs, fathers led daughters by the hand, all hoping the wilderness would shield them from the riders. But the Mongols were swift. Their cavalry could cover vast distances in days, outrunning refugees who traveled on foot or with slow-moving carts. Survivors who were caught often suffered worse for attempting to flee. Communities also turned to religious protection. In some cities, women were hidden in mosques or churches, trusting that sacred ground would shield them. But the Mongols, pragmatic and ruthless, rarely respected such sanctuaries. In Bukhara, chroniclers describe Mongol soldiers storming the Friday mosque, dragging women and children from within, their cries echoing against the marble walls. Sacred places offered no protection against an enemy who saw conquest itself as divine mandate. Even submission was a kind of survival strategy. Some rulers surrendered outright, offering tribute and handing over women voluntarily, hoping to save the city from massacre. This sometimes spared walls from fire, but it did not spare women from being taken. They were seized in smaller numbers, perhaps, or distributed more orderly, but the humiliation remained the same. For families, it was a bitter calculation. Surrender your daughters now, or lose them in bloodier fashion later. There are rare accounts of women resisting directly. Some chose suicide over capture, throwing themselves from city walls or into rivers as the Mongols stormed their home. Others fought beside their husbands, wielding knives or stones in hopeless defiance. Chroniclers tell of women who killed their own children before being captured, choosing death for their loved ones rather than a lifetime of slavery. These stories are haunting, but they underscore the desperation of those who knew exactly what awaited them. And yet, the Mongols anticipated all of this. Their system of conquest was designed to break survival strategies before they began. Refugees were hunted down, hidden women were smoked out, disguises were stripped away, and surrender, though it sometimes preserved lives, preserved them only as resources for the empire. No matter how families tried to protect their women, the machine of conquest devoured them all the same. The cruel irony is that survival strategies often amplify the suffering. A family that scarred its daughters might save them from a general's harem, only to see them condemned to years of back-breaking labor. A mother who hid her child might live just long enough to watch the Mongols drag her away anyway. Even those who fled to the wilderness often starved or froze, their desperate gamble ending in slow death instead of swift conquest. For the wives of defeated warriors, these strategies were both a testament to love and a reminder of futility. Their families tried everything: concealment, disguise, surrender, even death, to shield them. But against the Mongol system, nothing was enough. The conquerors had reduced survival itself to a cruel paradox. To live was to be claimed. To escape was nearly impossible. To resist was to invite annihilation. And so, in city after city, the same desperate rituals repeated. Doors barred, cellars dug, daughters disguised, all in vain. When the dust of conquest settled, the men lay in pits, and the women, whether scarred, hidden, or surrendered, were in Mongol hands. The strategies had failed, not because they lacked courage, but because the empire's terror machine was designed to make failure inevitable. Empires rise, empires fall. Cities that once lay in ruins are rebuilt. Dynasties toppled by horsemen give way to new rulers, and the cycle of history continues. But the wounds inflicted by the Mongols did not simply vanish when their armies withdrew. They lingered, etched not only in chronicles and ruins, but in the hearts and memories of those who survived. For the wives of defeated warriors, and for their descendants, the trauma of Mongol conquest became a legacy that echoed across generations. In the immediate aftermath, women who had been taken into captivity often bore children of mixed heritage. These children were raised as Mongols, loyal to the empire, speaking the language of their conquerors. For the mothers, this was a daily reminder of their own violation, to look into their child's eyes and see both themselves and the man who had killed their husband. The bond of motherhood was tangled with grief, humiliation, and survival. Many of these women carried this burden silently, unable to mourn openly, because their very survival depended on compliance. But the silence did not mean the trauma disappeared. It seeped into oral traditions, into whisper stories told at night, into songs sung in secret. Across Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe, folklore began to carry the echoes of Mongol terror. Tales of daughters taken, of mothers wailing over mass graves, of women who chose death rather than capture these, became part of the cultural memory. In some regions, these stories took on mythic dimensions, turning the Mongols into almost supernatural figures of destruction, embodiments of fear itself. Even centuries later, communities remembered. In parts of Persia, proverbs warn of the riders from the east, used by parents to frighten children into obedience. In Russia, epics known as bailani preserve the memory of invasions, often centering on the fate of women who were carried away by Tatar raiders. In Central Asian poetry, laments for lost daughters and enslaved mothers remained part of the cultural fabric long after the Mongol banners had disappeared from the steppes. Trauma became tradition, passed from one generation to the next. Religious responses also reflect this legacy. In the Islamic world, Mongol atrocities were interpreted as divine punishment, a scourge sent to chastise the faithful for their sins. Preachers invoked the suffering of women as proof of moral decline, urging repentance. In Christian lands, the Mongols were cast as apocalyptic figures, horsemen of revelation. Their treatment of women proved that the end of days was near. The trauma was not only personal, it was cosmic, reshaping how entire societies understood themselves and their place in history. Cultural practices began to change as well. In many regions touched by Mongol conquest, new traditions of protecting women arose. Families became more protective, more cautious, restricting the movement of daughters to shield them from potential capture. Folklore emphasized the importance of female chastity and honor, not only as a moral value, but as a survival mechanism. The memory of Mongol atrocities hardened gender roles, turning women's vulnerability during conquest into a perpetual warning. The scars were not only psychological, they were demographic. Entire regions lost staggering numbers of men, leaving behind widows who had to rebuild communities under the shadow of trauma. Some did so by clinging fiercely to their cultural traditions, preserving language and faith in defiance of assimilation. Others were forced to adapt, raising children who no longer spoke their tongue, carrying on lineages that no longer resembled their own. The trauma reshaped populations as much as it reshaped memory. Even today, the legacy persists. Genetic studies reveal the reach of Genghis Khan's bloodline, spread across millions of men in Asia. Every statistic, every strand of DNA is also a story of a woman who was forced, a family that was broken, a culture that was bent beneath the weight of conquest. Modern science has confirmed what chronicles long suggested. The Mongol Empire was not just written in battles and treaties, but in the bodies of the conquered. And perhaps most haunting is how the trauma became internalized. For centuries after the Mongol conquests, societies across Eurasia lived with the fear that it could happen again. The phrase "like the Mongols" became shorthand for annihilation, for cruelty beyond comprehension. The fate of women in particular was remembered as the empire's most terrifying weapon. Not just the slaughter, but the violation, the erasure of identity, the transformation of survival into punishment. These became the benchmarks of ultimate horror. For the wives of defeated warriors, the trauma was personal and immediate. For their descendants, it was inherited. Families grew up with the knowledge that their grandmothers or great-grandmothers had been taken, enslaved, or forced into marriage with their enemies. Lineages carried silence, shame, and whispered remembrance. In this way, the Mongols' cruelty outlived them. The Khans died, their empire fragmented, but the women that broke and the children born of that breaking carry the memory forward. So when we speak of the legacy of trauma, we are not only recounting the atrocities of the 13th century, we are acknowledging centuries of echoes. We are recognizing that the screams of Nishapur, Merv, Baghdad, and Kiev did not fade when the fires went out. They reverberated in lullabies, in proverbs, in folklore, in prayer, haunting reminders that conquest does not end when armies depart. Its shadows stretch on, etched into memory, blood, and identity itself. When people think of the Mongol Empire, They imagined thunderous hooves across the steppe, disciplined cavalry, and the unmatched power of the composite bow. And yes, the Mongols were master tacticians, brilliant logisticians, unmatched riders, but their greatest weapon wasn't forged of wood or steel. It was fear. Fear traveled faster than armies, seeped deeper than siege engines, and lasted longer than fire. The Mongols understood this better than any conqueror before them, and nowhere did they cultivate fear more effectively than in the fate they reserved for the wives of defeated warriors. Death for men was certain, but it was also final. To die in battle could even be seen as honorable. But to know that your wife, your daughters, your sisters would survive only to be seized, humiliated, and forced into the hands of your killers that broke resistance before a sword was drawn. The Mongols didn't hide this reality. They broadcast it. Survivors were deliberately spared so they could spread the stories. Rumors of mass rape, of public sorting rituals, of widows forced into marriage with their husbands' killers, spread like wildfire along caravan routes and across frontiers. The result was psychological warfare on the continental scale. By the time Mongol riders appeared on the horizon, cities were already half defeated, their defenders haunted by visions of what awaited their families. It was terror by design. A city that resisted could expect annihilation, men slaughtered, women divided like livestock, children either killed or assimilated. A city that surrendered might be spared total destruction, but the women would still be taken, parceled out as rewards, or absorbed into harems. The choice was between humiliation and extinction. Either way, the message was clear. No household, no family, no woman was beyond Mongol reach. The strategy worked. Chroniclers record entire cities opening their gates without a fight, their rulers calculating that surrender, however humiliating, was better than the extinction visited upon their neighbors. Husbands chose submission because they knew resistance would condemn their wives. Fathers handed over their daughters as tribute, hoping to preserve what was left of their people. The Mongols had turned women into the pivot point of their psychological warfare, symbols of what would happen if you defy the Khan. Fear also reshaped culture in conquered lands. Communities began to live with the expectation of loss. Families scarred or disguised daughters, hid them in monasteries, or sent them into exile, desperate acts that almost always failed. The futility of these strategies only deepened the terror. To resist the Mongols was not only dangerous, it was hopeless. What made this fear so effective was that it wasn't just about individuals. It was about continuity. The Mongols knew that by seizing wives and forcing them into new unions, they weren't just humiliating families in the present. They were erasing the future. Lineages ended, dynasties dissolved, cultures were absorbed. The very idea of identity became unstable when survival meant assimilation. For those facing Mongol armies, the fear wasn't only of death, it was of being erased from history, and it worked on every level. For the soldier on the walls, fear was personal: his wife, his daughters, his honor. For the city ruler, fear was political: the fate of Nishapur, Merv, and Baghdad as warnings etched in blood. For entire societies, fear was cultural: the memory of what had happened to their neighbors, carried in rumor and refugee, so vivid that even the strongest fortresses trembled before a single arrow flew. The Mongols didn't just conquer through battle, they conquered through anticipation. Their enemies defeated themselves in their minds long before the riders arrived. And at the center of that psychological collapse was the knowledge of what happened to women when the Khan's banners appeared. For the wives of defeated warriors, this meant they weren't simply victims of conquest. They were the empire's most terrifying weapon. Their suffering was the fuel that powered submission across continents. Their captivity, their forced marriages, their erasure became the whispered horrors that toppled cities before a siege began. Fear was the greatest weapon of the Mongols. It required no arrows, no supply lines, no battles. It spread on its own, multiplying with every atrocity, every captured woman, every story carried by survivors. It was efficient, devastating, and enduring. Even centuries later, long after the Mongol Empire itself had fractured, the fear remained. The very name of the Mongols was enough to conjure terror in folklore, prayer, and memory, and that was their true victory. Not the number of cities razed, not the size of their empire, but the way their shadow lingered in the minds of the conquered. Long after their banners disappear from the horizon, people still remember what happened to the wives of defeated warriors. And that memory, that fear outlived the empire itself.